Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. I've got another Goodwill terrain challenge for you today. I picked this up at the thrift store for 25 cents. It is just a plastic toy boulder and not much of a conversion here needed. I'm going to use this as a trap in my D&D game. So it's going to be the classic Indiana Jones style rolling boulder down the slope towards the players. So I'm going to base it. I'm going to paint it. I'm going to add some skulls. Maybe add some grime to it so it's not too monotone. And I think this thing's going to be done. So I don't actually think this is going to be a super challenging project. I did notice that we have a China here on the rock. I know, shocking. It's made in China. So I'm actually going to try to glue that portion down to the base so I don't have to deal with that. You could file it down if you really wanted that side up, but I'm pretty content with gluing that side down. It's actually the perfect diameter here too. It's about 2 inches wide. So a nice narrow corridor in a D&D game. And if I can get my glue to stick, if my super glue doesn't work, I'll hot glue it. Maybe I should have gone with the hot glue initially here. The only thing I really want to make sure is that I get it centered here. So I'm going to let that glue set up. It looks pretty centered. Come back, add some basing material. Okay, that looks nice and centered. So I'm going to leave it for a bit. Once I get the glue all set on the base, I go ahead and prime it with a flat black spray-on primer, can of spray paint. And once that dries, I am applying some PVA glue along the base. I want to put on some sand so that it has kind of an earthy texture on the base. I think this will work well with kind of general dungeons. I think it'll give a nice contrast because the stone's going to be gray and oftentimes the dungeon tiles might be gray. So having some soil and some grassy areas or mossy areas, I think is a nice contrast here. So I get the PVA applied all the way around. I'm trying to work it in so it's also in the parts that are in those crevices right under the boulder where the boulder would meet the ground. And once I have it spread around pretty good, then I just pour on my, I'd say medium coarse sand here. I think this was a purchase from Home Depot a long time ago, but really anywhere would do if you're near the beach or go to the beach or the lake maybe. But yeah, let that set up and then go on to painting here. With the painting, I just start off painting the soil down at the bottom of the base where the boulder meets the ground. And I do this with a burnt umber and a generous amount, trying to get good coverage here. And I'm going to dry brush on a lighter brown later on. At this point, it's time to start actually getting to the boulder itself. And usually when I'm doing gray stone, I'm doing 3 coats of gray. I start with dry brushing on a dark gray, and then a medium gray, and then kind of a ivory color. I don't go quite all the way up to white, but it's pretty close. And then depending upon what it is that I'm working on, I will go back with a brown or black wash, depending upon the texture. Now, this thing has some texture, which is nice. It has some divots, which is great. But it's not going to take a wash particularly well because it is fairly smooth. So I'm going to attempt to do this in a manner that isn't going to make the wash wholly necessary. One of the cool things about finding this boulder and turning this into a project is it's one of those instances where finding the thing kind of generated the encounter in terms of planning for my D&D game. So I didn't really have this in mind, but it prompted me not only to incorporate it as a trap, but also try to come up with a scenario that is a little bit more complex, whereas a legendary creature potentially can move the boulder. So the boulder's kind of going back and forth, and the party really needs to get through this corridor in order to go on and advance to the ultimate goal. And then also having areas where the party members can kind of tuck in and hide as the boulder's going on or going through, but not having enough for everybody. So it'll be interesting to see how they take on that challenge. Now, knowing them, they'll figure out a way to thwart what I've worked on. But you know, it's still fun and it's still cool that finding the item and the hunt of the item then prompted an idea that I didn't actually have previously. So if I hadn't gone and done this project and looked for this item, I wouldn't have had this idea. So I think that's kind of super cool. It can totally be the opposite, right? You can have the idea in mind and then you go hunting for the thing that fits it. And sometimes that's the case, but it's just interesting to me thinking about the creative process and how there's a little bit of an ebb and flow to it, at least for me. I'm sure it varies. So here we see some of the various highlights. I am going to try to add some contrast to the stone and do a technique here where I'm going to flick some dark red paint. And I actually think it turns out pretty well. And here's that dark red that I use. And I'm really going for just a really subtle blood spatter that's on the boulder, that this has rolled over some previous adventures. And there's a little bit of residual inner adventurer kind of pasted all over the outside of this boulder. But I think it's really easy to get carried away with this. When I did the Altar of Cain, I felt like I got carried away with it and it was just too much. So I'm trying to be a little bit more controlled in kind of a less controlled method, but I'm just getting some watered down, really dark red here. And I'm just holding my brush up kind of towards the boulder and just kind of flicking it. I just want to get these little red specks. And again, going for something that's really subtle that on the table, just like somebody will look at it and go, oh yeah, look at that. And not something that's going to really stand out and jump out at you, but just something really subtle. And I actually think that I achieved it pretty well. And it's just, yeah, a nice little detail that really can accent a piece, especially a piece like this where the boulder, even though you have the highlights, even though you have the dry brushes, it's kind of one color, right? There's different gradations in there, but it's kind of a gray boulder. So adding the base that is brown and green, adding some moss, which in a minute here I'm going to add some moss to the boulder as well. I think that really adds something to the project. Coming down the home stretch here, I dry brush on some territorial beige onto my burnt umber just to add some lighter soil areas. And the last step here is just to add on some flocking to simulate some mossy areas. So I'm going to use my Zap-A-Gap super glue to apply this to parts of the base. I do like the super glue for applying the flock. I don't know why, I just like it better than the Elmer's glue. It seems like it bonds pretty instantly. It's a little bit more control, but you could definitely do this step with PVA. I've done it with PVA before, but I've just gotten a habit of using super glue for this. And the mossy areas that I add onto the boulder itself are really kind of intended to hide that casting line that existed on the toy, which I'm able to do fairly well. All right, got the mossy areas there on the boulder, all set for my clear coats. I do a gloss coat and a matte coat. I usually will use the Tester's spray-on varnish. So once we're there, we'll be ready for the table. Hopefully this thing's able to give my D&D players a real hell of a time. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider hitting that like button, and I will see you next time.